Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today on diversity, equity, and inclusion, how to measure workforce diversity and establish DEI goals. Before we get started, for everyone on today's webinar, just want to go over some logistics and housekeeping matters. First, as with all presentations, this webinar is just provided for general informational purposes, and nothing in here is intended as legal advice. And if you are looking for specific legal advice on any particular issue, you should seek out counsel, independent counsel, or counsel at our firm on those issues. Also, for those of you who are lawyers who are listening in today, we will be offering MCLE credit. This webinar will qualify for 1.5 hours of professional responsibility credit, with one of those hours being creditable towards the diversity and inclusion requirement for Illinois MCLE. In order to receive your MCLE credit, please complete the survey following the webinar that's going to be sent to your email that you registered with, and you will receive credit for today's webinar. So welcome again, everybody. My name is Mike Warner. I am a partner at Franczek. I currently am the co-chair of our Labor and Employment Practice Group and co-chair of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee in the firm. As most of you know, our firm is based in Chicago, and we focus exclusively on representing employers and educational institutions in all aspects of labor and employment law, as well as education-related legal issues. I'm joined, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by Candice Rosevear, who is a principal in the labor discrimination practice, as well as the head of data analytics at Global Economics Group, a firm that focuses on the application of economic analysis and statistical analysis to a wide range of issues, including employment-related issues and diversity, equity, inclusion issues. Candice?
Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We're very happy to be hosting this webinar, and we hope that it's a good learning experience for all of us. I'll go over some key projects that apply to this presentation. Global Economics Group and myself have been engaged in various forms of analyses that are related to today's topic, both on the proactive side. So we work with companies, and we've also done research that's related to diversity issues. And also we do offer expert economist work in class action employment litigation. So I think of that, of course, as the reactive side of these issues. Some of the proactive work that we've done include setting diversity guidance for a city's school system. We've worked with a Fortune 100 company to build compensation models. We've worked closely with one of the largest US banks on an anti-discrimination analysis that involves AI and machine learning, which I know is a very big topic right now, especially for some of the larger institutions. It's also an area, because of its nature, black box nature, where there could be hidden discrimination. So we're going to cover that today as well. And then, and as I mentioned before, we've offered labor economist work as experts in various class action employment litigation.
Okay, so next slide. So just briefly to go over the agenda of what we're going to talk about today. First, we'll briefly touch on why. Why is this an important topic? I think you wouldn't be here today if it wasn't, but we'll just touch on some of the current imperatives we're seeing in that. Second of all, we'll briefly touch on the competing interests within organizations that need to be balanced when initiating a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative that includes use of statistical analysis and goal setting. Third, I'll provide the legal context and legal background necessary to properly discuss the use of statistics, artificial intelligence, and data analysis as a means to further your DEI initiatives. And then Candice will provide, for those of us who are less statistics and math savvy, a high-level overview of what she does as a labored economist and a statistician to further an organization's efforts to quantify, measure, and achieve DEI related goals and initiatives. Finally, we will apply those legal and economic principles to several case studies, that show, how the type of analysis Candice engages in and people in her field engage in, how that can actually be used within employers and organizations to supplement and further your diversity, equity, inclusion goals. And finally, we will go over some best practices for how to engage in that sort of work in both a legally compliant way, as well as an effective way that meets both your organization's business and institutional goals, as well as broader diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. So next slide. Oh, and finally, we'll answer any questions anyone has. And in terms of questions, at the end of each case study, we will also pause for any questions really on any part of the presentation, but also specifically on any aspects of the case studies that we're going to be going over. And particularly with respect to the case studies, love to get questions. The more interactive we can make this, the better. So why are we here? Why are we discussing this topic? As I alluded to before, I think that almost goes without saying, and I don't want, in this day and age, and I don't want to dwell on it, but obviously it's top of mind, and rightly so, for everybody in society, really, and everyone in business, everyone in government. It really is one of the most important issues of our time. Just by way of example, in terms of how front of mind this is and how important it is. 2 weeks ago, I was on a webinar much like this. It was billed as a webinar focused on billing and pricing and data analytics in the pricing of law firm services. It was a webinar that included partners from and CFOs from large law firms, as well as in-house GCs. It was nowhere on the agenda that was distributed prior to the webinar, but about 45 minutes of the 3-hour webinar were devoted exclusively to larger clients and institutions measuring large law firm DEI initiatives and using that as a criteria for law firm selection. So top of mind in all aspects of society, in all aspects of business, in all aspects of government, and rightly so, given both of what society has been through, really, really since the history of our country, and obviously what's happened in the last year and a half. Okay. Can move on to the next slide. So all this being said, historically, there are some tensions that both Candice and I have observed in working with clients and organizations when you're attempting to use the sort of analysis that we are going to be talking about today as part of your diversity, equity, and inclusion toolbox. Everybody, I think, recognizes the value of analytics and data and what it can add, particularly in terms of goal setting and helping an institution achieve its goals. And obviously, somebody who is your DEI officer who is charged with moving the needle on improving your work environment, improving the diversity of your workforce, improving the employee morale, is going to want to use analytics to measure how the organization is performing and actually set aggressive goals to achieve those goals. Obviously, there's always a operations and financial component. Historically, in some organizations, DEI and diversity and equity was an important goal, but it may be subordinate to other broader business or organizational goals. Attitude being, well, it's good, we need to do this, but it can't interfere with our primary mission. It can't interfere with our primary business. As discussed on the last slide, I think there's an increasing realization that diversity, equity, inclusion is good business, and it is an imperative for every organization. So some of that tension, to the extent it existed in the past, may be going by the wayside. But one of the things that an organization always needs to be aware of also is sustainability. In the wake of the unrest last year and ongoing with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, this is obviously a top of mind issue. But from an operations and finance perspective, there is no easy fix to some of the issues we're going to be talking today. And so any commitment to engage in the sort of work that Candice and I are talking about has to be sustainable. It has to be long-term, and the operations and finance part of the organization must be willing and able to give it the time and resources that is needed to truly, again, move the needle and move things forward in a positive fashion. Finally, and this is something I can speak to in my role as a lawyer, us lawyers are always saying, yep, that's fine. You can do whatever you want, but just don't get a suit. So Candice, how do you approach these issues as a labor economist?
So, just to add a little bit to what you've said, Mike, data, I agree, can be a very powerful source of information if it's used correctly. And I've seen so many times, where if it's misused, it can lead folks down the wrong path. And that's especially true in this environment where we have, different interests. We have people potentially within an organization with different views of what might be appropriate or necessary to achieve goals. And then we also have the legal side, which is sort of saying, you can do this, but only do this much. Don't say these particular things. You can say this, and what I can do as a data analyst and an expert economist on labor issues is that I have an understanding through my profession of this ever-changing legal and regulatory environment, along with my ability to work with data. work closely with data science teams, understand their language. So I think that's where, firms like mine, Global Econ, we possess, we're sort of in this space that that allows us to act as a liaison between, the various parties within an organization.
Okay. All right. So to set the analytical framework from a legal perspective, it's important to discuss two key concepts that are front and center on all issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's important to understand the relationship between the two, but also to know they're not synonymous, and in some ways, as I'll explain, they can be opposed to each other when you're trying to further diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. First of all, the legal definition of what is unlawful discrimination. For those of you who practice in the area and who are lawyers, a lot of this is familiar to you, but it's important to set the table as to what exactly are we talking about. So under Title VII, which prohibits employment discrimination, as well as other federal, state, and employment or discrimination laws, there generally are two different theories of unlawful discrimination: disparate treatment and disparate impact. Disparate treatment is the classic intentional discrimination, making a decision because of a person's protected status. Race under Title VII, that would be race, color, religion, national origin, sex, marital status, or age. State laws include other categories. Other laws, ADA and ADEA, treat age and disability as a protected category, but it's intentionally, purposely taking one of those categories into account in making a decision. The other form of discrimination in the legal sense is disparate impact discrimination. This was a theory first recognized by the Supreme Court in the case of Briggs versus Duke Power in 1970. And it has since been codified in Title VII in the 1991 Civil Rights Act, and also another federal and state legislation that in as shorthand is really a form of unintentional discrimination. And disparate impact discrimination recognizes that a facially neutral practice that doesn't on its face make a decision based upon race or a protected category can still be unlawful if that practice, process, or criteria disproportionately impacts a protected group, and the justification for using that practice or criteria is not sufficiently job-related and consistent with business necessity, and there are other equally valid and effective alternatives to meeting the same goal that are less discriminatory that are available. Both of these theories recognize in the legal sense and under the law that when it comes to making decisions about employment, about education, about whether to make loans, whether to do business with people or entities, race, ethnicity, gender, other protected categories should not matter and should not impact the outcome of those decisions. On the other hand, the principles and theory of systemic or structural racism, which is more of observation than a legal theory. And in fact, it is not a concept that, as I'll explain in a minute, that was really accurately captured by existing law. Systemic racism recognizes that it's a form of racism that is actually embedded through laws, regulations, and traditional existing structures within a society. Systemic racism holds that, contrary to what the law says it's prohibited, that race always matters, whether conscious or not, and impacts outcomes in various forms of societal and economic decisions due to these very structures and unconscious biases. And as Candice will explain, even though data, statistics, and analytics is often viewed as being objective and non-biased, there are ways that these structural inequities and biases can be embedded in data and in analytical tools that businesses and organizations use to make decisions. So here's where the principles of legal non-discrimination and systemic racism diverge. Title VII has been on the books since 1964, prohibiting discrimination in employment. There are post-Civil War era laws that have been on the books since the 1870s, prohibiting discrimination in taking race into account in various decisions. Even though those laws say that race and other protected classifications should not matter, the reality is, and we've seen this in people who've had their eyes open have seen this for a long time, but it's become even more apparent in the last year and a half, and I think a lot more people are seeing this and realizing this and coming to grips with it. Race still matters, and the data proves it. For example, Black employees are still chronically underrepresented in many industries and positions. The wealth gap and wage gap between genders, races, and ethnicities is still very real. And Candice, you can probably share some additional details and insight on some of those realities.
Yes, definitely. And I'll add to the list under the first bullet point that there's a large literature on that people of color and women lack the social capital and access to networks that white men have sort of been developing and accumulating over the past decades. And we see this affect employment and returns to education. And also, in particular fields such as asset management, for example, that relies heavily on your social network and access to capital. And I think a recent study I read shows that people of color and women make up less than 2% of the asset management industry. Even though they make up 39% of the United States population.
So, in a nutshell, the existing law prohibits discrimination, but really doesn't require equity, and also does not address this problem, somewhat intractable problem of systemic racism. And in fact, the law as currently constituted, which says that race should not matter at all. The requirement of colorblindness actually can create some significant challenges to engaging in the sort of initiatives in analysis that Candice and I are talking about today. So what we want to share with you today is, that in terms of what the role that data and analysis can play is still important, but part of the way to do this in a valid, legal, and effective way is to recognize these tensions, come to grips with these tensions, and develop legal and business strategies to help overcome them in order to achieve your organization's goals in diversity, equity, and inclusion space. So to put a finer point on this tension, legal tension between addressing systemic racism and unlawful discrimination. The law, as currently constituted, by Supreme Court precedent, does hold that the use of race-conscious decision-making to remedy even a well-established, well-known historical racial disparity, i.e. something that is a function of systemic racism, in many cases may be and will be unlawful because it takes race explicitly into account and is a decision based upon race. Good examples of this are imposing strict quotas for hiring based upon race or gender, making decisions based upon race, even if it's favoring a historically disadvantaged classification or race or ethnicity. The most recent Supreme Court pronouncement, specifically in the employment arena on this topic, is Ricci Di Stefano case arising out of firefighter exam used by the city of New Haven, Connecticut. City of New Haven observed that the entrance exam that they were using for determining qualification for firefighters had a statistical racial disparity that disadvantaged Black applicants. After the test was given and applicants had relied on the results of that test, they threw out the test results because of the racial disparity. Despite the court recognizing that this test created this racial disparity, the court held that the city's disregard of those test results, because of the racial outcome of those test results, violated Title VII. So ultimately, the bottom line holding of this decision was that before an employer can engage in intentional race-conscious decision-making for the asserted purpose of avoiding a outcome that creates a racially disparate impact, the employer must have a strong basis and evidence to believe that if it doesn't engage in that sort of decision making, it will be subject to disparate impact liability. In other words, to justify using race in making a conscious decision, a employer must show a significant statistical disparity in outcomes between minority and non-minority candidates. They must show that the test or criteria that is producing that outcome was not justified by business necessity. And then finally, that the other options for remedying the disparity that do not require an explicit consideration of race are not going to achieve the same results. So this, as alluded to on an earlier slide, this is a very fine needle to thread. Basically, an employer who is undertaking this analysis, if they get it wrong, is at risk of being sued on either side, either by the historically advantaged group who is claiming race discrimination, reverse race discrimination, or the group, the historically disadvantaged group that is potentially being subjected to disparate impact discrimination. They may have a potential claim if the employer does not strike the right balance on these issues. In terms of looking forward, as some of you may know, the real front line on this battle of the use of race in decision making in recent years has been in the area of higher education and college admissions. This goes back to the 1970s with the Bakke case. There was the Bollinger case several years ago. And right now, there's litigation involving the Harvard University's admission process. It's initiated on behalf of Asian American student applicants, and the plaintiffs in that case alleged that the consideration of race in the Harvard admissions process is discriminatory against Asian American candidates. Under current law in higher education, race may be considered as a legitimate factor in order to further the legitimate goal of diversity. However, that use in either employment or education may be further curtailed. It's no secret that the Supreme Court has tilted in the even more conservative direction with the last presidential administration. And this could be, if cert is granted on this case, it could be an invitation for the current Supreme Court to further curtail the use of race as a explicit factor in making decisions to remedy the past effects of discrimination or to remedy issues of systemic racism. So all of this can create some pessimism on the part of folks, and when you're talking about, well, what can we do about this? From a standpoint of using data, much like what I just was talking about with Ricci, you may think employers are in a no-win scenario. First off, if you collect and measure the data, is it just going to create bad evidence? Are we going to show everyone how far we fall short of our diversity, equity, inclusion goals? And if we disclose that or share that data, is that going to be is that going to get us sued, or at minimum, is it going to be a public relations or business nightmare in terms of what our customers and what society at large thinks of us as an organization? On the other hand, if we use data to set goals, set aspirational goals of where we want to move towards as an organization, become more diverse, become more equitable, are we at risk of being sued for reverse discrimination? because that data and those goals are going to be misused or misinterpreted in terms of what the organization is trying to achieve. Finally, given these challenges, is undertaking this sort of initiative just too expensive and time consuming given the challenges and given that the fact that there is no easy fix to the sort of issues we're grappling with in discussing here. So, but Candice and I are eternal optimists, and I hope all you on the call are also eternal optimists, because you wouldn't be listening to us in interested in this topic if you weren't. There's a much better case for actually doing the sort of work that Candice and I are talking about than that I think should overcome any pessimism. Number one, it's an axiom in business and life: what gets measured gets improved. Data disclosure can be a very powerful tool for change. Data also shed light on an organization and shed light on what actually is going on in an organization. And in order to take steps towards true diversity, equity, and fairness, you need to have tools at your disposal to look at whether your organization is truly making decisions that are equitable and fair. Finally, rigorous and appropriate data analysis can help organizations overcome the sort of legal challenges that I just outlined above, and make sure that your goals that you do set and the initiatives you do undertake are not only lawful and legal, but also are effective at moving the ball forward.
Thank you, Mike, for that background. I think that's very helpful. Now, I'm going to get into the part of the presentation where we're going to go over an analytical framework that I've developed for this presentation. And really, this sort of revolves around workforce composition analysis. And the first step to an analysis like this, in my mind, is to ask the right questions. So first, we want a descriptive accounting of where we stand today. That's fairly straightforward. You can figure out your workforce composition based on self-identification data, and that's fairly straightforward. The next question, though, is how did we get here? What processes got us to this place where we're doing really well in some areas, or where there's some areas where we can actually improve our workforce composition in terms of diversity? The next question is forward-looking. Where do we want to be as an organization? And how do we get there? So the answer of how we get there, we'd have to look backwards as well into our historical patterns and places for opportunities that we can take advantage of. Now the questions, I realize, may seem very obvious at first, but I believe that staying curious about simple seeming questions like this can uncover hidden opportunities to improve diversity within an organization's processes. And the answers to the questions, of course, are going to be company specific and idiosyncratic to the company's history, its HR policies, its geography, even its exposure to systemic discrimination. I want to add also that, sometimes a DEI hiring program, it can be less effective and more expensive than, say, a well-designed retention and promotion program that affects greater change. So part of the analytical framework also includes a valuation component where, we're not just automatically going to run towards the hiring program, but we're going to see where there's other opportunities that could actually be more effective for us to focus on. The second point, we're going to explore the organization fully, past, present, and future. There's many, many ways to go about this, and I've highlighted a few areas here. There's an applicant flow analysis where we would trace an applicant or a group of applicants through the entire organization, from their application to promotion, retention, and to their exit. We want to trace the problems and the opportunities to the source. So, for example, there might be a biased screening question or a biased test that's used in an application for employment. We might have a great relationship with a university that provides a large portion of diverse and highly qualified applicants. There might be an AI model somewhere down the line that is using biased data, or it's biased by design, unintentionally so. There could be a retention program that's missing out on opportunities to improve diversity and inclusion. In this step, we also want to perform validation studies for any standardized process. This is a point within an organization where there could be a potential issue. Whenever you're using a standardized test, you're likely going to have disparities there. So one question we ask, is the test or control job related and consistent with business necessity? If it is, then it's okay to include it. And one example that comes to mind is if you have a weightlifting requirement for a firefighter position, that probably is going to discriminate against women in the initial test, but once we explore a little further, it actually makes sense why it's there. And next, we're going to look for areas of systemic racism that could be impacting the organization. And we're going to check for opportunities here. We can list the weaknesses, and within those weaknesses, we might be able to uncover some areas where we can improve our diversity and inclusion. As some examples, and again, you may not face these particular examples in your organizations, but if you imagine a low-skilled, low-income workforce. Latinx and Black Americans face something that the literature calls spatial barriers. Now, spatial barriers to employment, I'm sure you've all heard of food deserts in some communities that are people of color communities. Well, there's the same sort of concept in some cities and areas that there is a lack of access to jobs. So a spatial barrier to employment might be that this group of people has to commute farther than their similarly situated white counterpart. So what can a company do there? Within the law, there might be some creative ways to help, with commuting expenses, or with commuting just by sending, a bus or something like that to help people. And then, I mentioned the racial and ethnic wealth gap and the social network gap that impacts the field of asset management. In that field in particular, having a track record is very important. But what we see today is that, people of color and women, they are managing first generation funds. They haven't had enough time to build that track record. So even though there is a large literature on performance of these asset managers and how they, after you control for various things, there is no difference by race and ethnicity and by gender as well.
Yeah. And Candice, from a legal perspective, going back to your comment about validation studies, and it's no secret that the words under that you use, job related and consistent with business necessity, are identical to what I used the first few slides earlier. Yeah. And I think this is a particularly important point to emphasize from the standpoint of historically, when I, as a employment lawyer, and Candice is a labor economist, helping labor and employment lawyers in their work, that sort of analysis, at least in my experience, has been historically reactive and looking towards, okay, are there practices in our organization that are going to subject us to legal liability for disparate impact discrimination? And oftentimes, organizations did not do that sort of analysis unless something popped up saying, okay, yes, we see there's a legal risk here, we need to dig in further. I think the current focus and recognition of how important these issues are creates a real opportunity to use this not in just a reactive way, but in a really proactive way to say, and it's a slightly different question. It's not, what is going to expose us to legal liability, but what sort of data analysis can we do to identify and root out existing practices in our organization that may be perpetuating, some structural and systemic elements that contribute to systemic racism. So it's the same kind of analytical framework, but I think it's approached with a slightly different intent and goal. It's not just we want to avoid getting sued for discrimination, but we want to affirmatively root out things within our organization that may be contributing to some of the systemic inequities that we see both within our organization, but also the economy at large.
Right, and another example, is that we know that education is rewarded in the labor market, and we also know that Black Americans face a lower return on their education investment, for example. And so something that an organization can do with that knowledge is perhaps take into account that let's say an organization wants to recruit from a particular tier of universities. Now, if you can take that off the table and then invest in some in-house training for new hires, for example, that could help improve diversity in the face of these systemic issues that we face. So now for this analytical framework, so the next thing we would want to do is looking forward after we've identified these historical trends, is that we would want to build a model that shows what happens when we make particular HR decisions. So the model is going to be based on historical organizational trends, but also labor market projections. And then we would, introduce to the model our new DEI plan and see how our metrics change. Okay. So the third component is collecting good data and creating and analyzing DEI metrics. So we want to collect and compute salient, comparable DEI metrics on the workforce itself, as well as on recruiting, hiring, promotion, retention, and termination decisions, which are sometimes overlooked. I feel a lot of the focus is on hiring. There is a power of self-identification when you need the data, and I think most companies are able to collect it, at least from their workforce. But it just collecting, the act of collecting it is beneficial to organizations because their employees see that they are making this step, in diversity and inclusion. And a lot of employees care about that very much. There are statistical ways. I don't want to get too in the weeds for this presentation, but there are statistical methods that can and are used to understand a person's race and ethnicity based on probabilities. So this is helpful when we have really great, rich applicant pool data, but we're not gathering a person's race, ethnicity from their application. So those who aren't hired, we don't really know who they are. If we want to test, in a proactive state, we want to figure out the probability. We can look at a person's last name and also their address. And so we do a form of, it's called Bayesian improved surname geocoding, and it gives us a probability that's highly correlated with reality of a person's race and ethnicity, especially if the person lives in a highly segregated area, like Chicago, which unfortunately, that's the unfortunate situation, but it helps the statistics. And then we'd want to work.
Candice, and here is, as a lawyer, here's where historically some of us, our spidey sense starts tingling, and we sense danger when people start talking about collecting all this data, because we're immediately thinking, how is this going to be used against our clients? So,
right.
Again, to not be chicken little and not be the lawyer pessimist. It's important to know, yes, there are legal issues and risks to doing this wrong, but there are legal benefits to doing it correctly. And, lesson number one is, have counsel involved at every step of this process to make sure that it's being collected in a sound manner, it's being protected by confidentiality and privileged where possible. And if that is the organization's goal for the analysis, and don't go into this process blindly.
Right. Fourth thing is to set data-driven, achievable benchmarks based on everything we've learned up to this point about the organization and what we hope to achieve. The fifth thing that to pay attention to in this framework is that you want to make sure that whatever changes you're making, or even just the current state of your company and your practices, that there are no practical or statistically significant disparities at all points in the organization's decision making. So we want to make sure that whatever program we are introducing to improve diversity and inclusion, that we're not also introducing some form of disparity. And if there are problem areas, we also want to make sure that we're working towards addressing those. And I do want to note that the focus of this presentation is obviously on employment, but the same tests in this framework can be applied to various areas, including fairness in AI, in housing, education, fair lending. Measuring disparities. I mentioned earlier practical and statistical significance. Very briefly, this slide has a lot on it, but the point here is that there's two things that we want to look at. We want to first see, using the disparate impact tests that are present in class action lawsuits, we want to first see if there's a difference between hiring rates between the races, for example. And then we want to ask if it's a practically meaningful difference. So this has nothing really to do with statistics. It's just, is there a noticeable difference here? So one method that's used is called the impact ratio, the adverse impact ratio, AIR, which is also known as the 4/5 rule. And this is used when an output is dichotomous. So you're either hired or you're not at a particular step in the hiring process, or you're either promoted or you're not, or you're fired or you're not. Now this says that 80%, if there's a greater than 80% difference, then if the selection rate is less than 80% of that of the favored group, then there might be evidence of disparate impact. And there are several other. Sorry, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah. So Candice, us employment lawyers are familiar with the 4/5 rule from the EEOC Uniform Selection Guidelines, and
yep.
Just for us non-statisticians, I've always thought of this, like you said, it's just kind of a gut check. It's a way that those of us who don't have a PhD in economics can apply a fairly easy formula to identify whether, okay, do these numbers, create are we seeing something that requires further inquiry and analysis from a disparity impact perspective?
Exactly. So that test is commonly always used. And then there's test for statistical significance. And the question here is, does a difference truly exist, or is it a result of chance? So this involves hypothesis testing. You've probably heard of the 2SD test, a Z-test that says if anything greater than 2 standard deviations in the difference in the hiring rates, that is considered statistically significant. And usually 5% is used. And then, for proactive and also reactive, depending on what stage of the litigation you're in and what side you're on, logistic regression is a really great tool where and what this helps us answer is, after controlling for legitimate and non-discriminatory factors, is protected class status still related to the outcome, right? So we know we don't want that to be the case after we've identified similarly situated people and valid controls, right? So I put together this example here. All of you likely know about, the AIR is calculated. So if the high rate of Black Americans is 45%, and for white it is 70%, the AIR is simply 45 divided by 70%, which is 0.64. And so the problem with the AIR is that, it really gives a sense of magnitude, but it's subject to sampling error. So if you have small sample sizes, you can have some big problems. And that's where the flip-flop rule comes into play. So that means that if you have a small sample and you see a significant AIR that's, below 80, if you take one person from the fail rate and put it into the pass bucket, and that shifts the AIR above 80%, then you've likely got a problem with your sample size. So statistical tests can help with type 1 errors of that nature, where but it can control some of the issues that we have with AIR giving a false positive. And then the example I put together here is just simply to make a point that test design matters. So, and I wanted to point out this combined samples problem. What we have is the first panel, we're calling it California, and we have an AIR of 1, which is perfect. Both groups, Black and white, are hired or pass at the same rate, 75%. For Illinois, same thing is true. It's a perfect AIR, passing at 10%. But when you combine the samples, you've got a company-wide AIR that's 0.68, which throws, that falls below the threshold of 0.8 that regulators tend to look for. And it's also statistically significant by the 2SD test as well as the Fisher's exact test. Okay. So now we're going to get into some client examples and apply some of the framework that I went over, and also the legal framework that Mike covered. So companies regularly make HR decisions around the various decision points on promotion, RIF, hiring, et cetera. Sometimes they use statistical models and sometimes they don't. In the example we're going to go over now, this is a medium-sized company that has a workforce of 10,000, asked us to analyze its workforce and set some DEI goals for them for the next 12-month period. All right. So what we want to do is apply analytical rigor to the DEI metrics and benchmarking. We're going to use various statistical techniques, data sources, geospatial analysis, and set some data-driven achievable benchmarks. We're going to take into account the workforce versus the labor force, as well as the hiring versus the applicants. Those are different analyses relying on different sources. And an aspirational goal in DEI is certainly not going to usually be as simple as saying you need 50-50 for gender. The labor force is going to tell us who we have in our labor force that we could potentially fill positions with. And then, as I mentioned, the disparate impact tests are always part of these analyses. So potential pitfalls is that we haven't collected enough data to form these rigorous metrics. Mike covered the legal fears, collecting the EEO mandated data doesn't typically tell the story. And then there's additional costs around collecting data. So there might not be a clear data-driven view of what the goals are, unclear communication to management after you set the goals regarding what's permissible and impermissible uses of data. And then there's always the risk of disclosure too, and the misuse and misinterpretation by others. So that's why it's very important not only to hire an analyst or consultant, statistician to help, but also to have a lawyer involved with all of these plans. So this chart shows that for this company, the first thing we want to do is just get a handle on their workforce composition. So this is showing the racial and ethnic composition of the employees in position X at a particular location and particular moment in time. And the next thing that we're going to do is we want to use all the available data that we have at our disposal to try to figure out what the appropriate diversity, equity, and inclusion goal should be. And we want to look at various sources, whatever really we can get our hands on. Job board data is typically a very rich data source for this. We can see who is coming to us. We want to look at recruiting data, the composition of the universities that we're interested in. We also can, in the absence of that data, we can also rely on census data in some cases. And there are surveys done that are very specific and oftentimes used in analyses like this to assess the labor pool at the regional, state, or metro area. I believe that the finest level of aggregation for that survey data is at the PUMA. And Chicago, for example, has about 20 PUMAs, just to give you a sense of how large that is. So once we've done this, we've come up with, an aspirational goal. And we can, very simply just compare the company workforce to what we think, based on applying proper weights to the data we've collected and analyzed. We've come up with this goal that we think would better reflect the labor pool and improve our diversity. Okay. We do this. This is meant to represent doing this many times for each company segment, the entire company. And it really just depends on how the organization is set up as to how many times we would do this at what level of aggregation.
And Candice, I think that's a point worth emphasizing in terms of the need to do really to make this both effective and legally compliant, to actually look at the workforce and the organization as it exists. If it is a organization that is geographically spread out, the goals for each office in each labor market may differ.
Right.
Goals for different positions will differ. It is, segmentation, both from the legal and achievability perspective, is important, because obviously a company-wide goal of X% is not necessarily a accurate or realistic goal, nor, as we've alluded to before, is that necessarily a goal that conforms with legally what you have to do to actually, to move forward in a positive direction to meet these aspirational targets.
Mm-hmm. And we just received a question. It says, the question is, if the business segment has employees across the US at different locations, can the model be adjusted to that scenario? And the answer is yes. The model is highly adjustable to really any type of configuration that we see or that we sort of want to adapt the model to address. So that's a great question. And so for the slide that I have up right now is an example of what the dashboard might look like for a particular DEI program. Now we're switching over to gender just for this graphic, even though the prior slides were focused on ethnicity and race. And what you see here are the various positions. This is synthetic data. Position X could really be a different location across the US, for example, to get back to the question. They could be at different management levels or whatever, however you want to slice this data. And then we're going to give an overview of the company as a whole. The point of this chart is that while my team might be doing a lot of analytics and just working the data, getting everything gathered, testing, weighting it, doing valuations to figure out what programs are going to work the best. This slide is really the end result of our work. So this is important for when you got to get to the point. If you only have 2 minutes with a CEO, right, or another decision maker, so that's why the dashboards, I think, are quite important for analyses like this. So now we're going to get into a client example that is focused on discrimination in machine learning models. So many companies are starting to use, I'm sure you've heard, this newer statistical technique known as AI or machine learning. And they're using it in hiring and retention models. They're using it to make credit decisions and for a whole host of different applications. One model that comes to mind was Amazon's recent hiring algorithm, which you may have read about. It actually, I think it discriminated against women because the model itself, if the word women appeared on the resume, it automatically reduced the score for that person. So obviously, people involved in women's NCAA, those who attended a women's college, they were disproportionately negatively affected by this algorithm by one of the biggest tech companies in our country, in our world. Very sophisticated data science team, right? So this is happening, especially, we see these issues across the board. Luckily, Amazon says they didn't use this model, but that problem was bad, and they took apart the part of the company that was responsible for building it. So we have regulators that are very interested in potential disparate impact, disparate treatment issues arising from these models. And I think that for the purpose of this presentation is that there could be issues where the model is actually undermining the DEI objectives. So it's good in a proactive stance to really understand what's going on with the models. So in this example, the clients asked us to evaluate the fairness in general, racial, ethnic, and gender of the AI and machine learning models it uses to make hiring and retention decisions. So one thing that's important about models like this is that we could run into issues with proxies. We would never expect for a model to explicitly include factors, for race and gender, but the models very well can include another variable or a set of variables that work together to perform a near proxy for race and ethnicity. So zip code is one example that comes to mind, especially if there's a highly segregated part of the country that we're focused on. Android phone use as a proxy for Black has been identified in certain lending models as a high correlation for race. So the proxies can be found really anytime models are used to help companies make decisions. Another point here to make is that the machine learning models will reflect the data that is used to train them. And this is true for any model, a linear model, a simple model, any type of decision-making process, even made by a human being with the model, in our head, that, if there's garbage in, garbage out, the model can be biased as a result of how it's trained. And, in many cases, the data that these machine learning models use are coming from a systemically discriminatory world, which gives us discriminatory results.
And the Amazon case is a good example of that. It's obviously been well documented from a gender perspective, what the concerns about within the technology community, the lack of female talent, particularly in the technical fields, not the lack of female talent, but the lack of representation. And so if Amazon is using their historical hiring data to train their AI model, it is not surprising the AI model produces a result that looks like their current workforce.
Right, and they're over the past several years of where they had resume data, and their workforce is primarily men.
And it's also not surprising it may include proxies that reflect decisions that may have a potential bias in them based upon potential biases in their prior decision making made by the actual managers who are hiring within the company.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So a quick question I just caught my eye was asked, what do you mean by how it is trained? So how it is trained, machine learning models take a large data set and they train themselves on that data before they're released on new data out in the wild. So that's just a word, meaning that's how we get the model up and running. And it learns on a training data set is the terminology. I hope that helps answer the question.
And actually, going back to a prior question, and it's something probably we should have paused after the first case study, but there's a question: when an organization is setting goals, do you recommend using the word goal or another term such as aspiration, ambition, or something else? And that's a great question and a very difficult question. As I mentioned before, under current existing case law, setting actual strict goals or quotas based upon race or a protected category is potentially unlawful. So the use of the word goal, particularly if it's a goal that is a hard and fast rule or quota, is very problematic. Now, I have to be candid on the flip side, understanding the realities of organizations and businesses. It is difficult to get change and to get people to take aspirations or initiatives seriously, sometimes without setting goals. If you're talking about a sales organization who is used to working towards goals, quotas, and whatnot, use of a softer, fuzzier term may be met with a lack of attention. And what the best answer I have is, working with, and this is why it's really is a multidisciplinary, initiative you have to undertake as far as working with your lawyers, working with your HR professionals, working with your diversity, equity, inclusion people to come up with the best way to communicate what it is you're trying to do, whether it's aspiration, whether it's a goal, in a way that is going to be accurately interpreted by the people responsible for implementing and making decisions. If your organization is such that you can use the word goal with managers knowing the nuances of that, meaning it doesn't necessarily mean you hire to a certain number, that may be adequate. Other times you may have to tread more lightly in terms of how you actually communicate the initiative, and who you and you may communicate it differently to different groups.
There was a question also about how to determine what the achievable benchmarks are. And so achievable benchmark would mean what is actually possible given the labor force that we have access to. So we wouldn't necessarily expect our company to reflect the exact population, racial composition of the population of the United States. It really depends on who is applying to our company, who are we retaining, who is successful once they get into the company.
Yeah.
So achievable benchmarks is an output from an in-depth analysis of all of those things that and an analysis of the available labor market.
And am I correct, Candice, that the scenario one you went over, that's one of the primary questions that analysis is attempting to answer. Using data from the labor market, data from your applicant pool, and whatnot. And speaking of applicant pool, there's another question of why aren't you gathering race and ethnicity at the application stage? I realize that it's not necessarily required, but I'm familiar with that as de rigueur. And the question is correct that except for federal contractors who are subject to OFCCP affirmative action requirements, there is no legal requirement to ask for race and ethnicity and gender data at the time a person applies. If it's a federal contractor, that data does need to be tracked. That being said, historically, for some of the concerns about collecting information that I alluded to before, there are a lot of employers that haven't done that, whether it's a legal concern or whether it's just a cost or efficiency concern, not the bandwidth or resources to do it. A lot of employers have not done that. That being said, for all the reasons as to what the questioner alludes to, and as we're discussing, here, I think that is becoming more commonplace. I think it is to get the true accurate picture of your effectiveness of your efforts. That is something that companies should begin considering.
Yeah, and oftentimes in the data that I've seen, if it is collected or it can be backfilled from the hires, the problem that we see is that for the portion that is not self-reporting, we really have to be careful about selection bias and why aren't they self-reporting? Is it the system, is that over-representing a particular group, for example, which could make our statistics very meaningless. So that's another point I'll throw in. Let's see. Now, I think I'm going to skip, just to keep, I've got my eye on the time here. I'm going to skip ahead to this example of the machine learning model. And sort of, what we were faced with was a model that on these two dimensions of their adverse impact ratio versus the predictive power of the machine learning model. We face this model that has an adverse impact. It crosses the line just above 70%, but it's highly predictive, right around 98% explanation, predictive power. So what we want to do is figure out why that's happening, what variables or combination of variables is causing that. So let's just imagine, a hiring model that gives you a score for predicted success of an applicant. Each dot represents a version of that model. So what we've done is taken the model and we've run it, say 1,000 times, different variations of it, dropping certain variables and combinations of variables, and then testing it along these dimensions of disparities tests and also predictive power. So, maybe a model might have GPA, school tier, relevant job experience, all valid things to control for, but perhaps zip code made its way in there through the data science team. And we run into some problems once we include zip code. Now zip code could be a proxy for race and ethnicity, but it also could be useful because it could give us some information about proximity to the workforce, to the workplace, right? How far does that person have to commute? So it's a little bit of a tricky scenario, but the point of this chart is to show that every dot that's above this 80% threshold, it's above the regulator's threshold, and also it shows that you can get a very highly predictive model in this illustrative example, that also complies with some of these tests that we commonly see.
Yeah, and to just from a practical perspective, I find this fascinating, and it's hard to get my brain around, but if I understand what that model shows is when you're looking at the two dimensions from a disparate impact analysis, on the one hand, does the criteria, hiring criteria you're using have a disparate impact on a protected group versus how accurate is that criteria in predicting, say, whether this person is going to be a strong employee. This allows you to actually tweak your criteria and model to come up with the right balance between a model and criteria that are, meet your needs of selecting the best employees while not doing so in a way that creates a legally problematic disparity. And it allows you to look at the various criteria in your hiring model to identify those things that, okay, well, this has a disparity here. We can make it doesn't add that much to the effectiveness of our process. We can take it out or change it.
Exactly, and that's where opportunities might lie to improve our diversity as well by eliminating and getting, allowing access to a different group. So we have another question. In determining whether a goal is achievable, I assume you might also do modeling to determine how long it will take to achieve the goal and whether there should be a time frame communicated for the goal. Do you recommend a time frame be communicated or not? Could a time frame lead to some employees interpreting it more like a quota? And I think to answer that from my perspective is that yes, a time frame can be communicated, and this would be sort of in the forward-looking step of the framework I went over, where we definitely would want to take into account the cost in terms of dollars as well as time, and the model would guide us to those answers.
Yeah.
And Mike, you could probably answer the last two.
Yeah, and among other things, if I'm correct, your modeling will show, okay, you can factor in what do you anticipate the rate of hiring and retention to be within your organization? What would be the impact of if there's a downturn in business and you have to go through a reduction in force? How would that impact the time frame in terms of achieving some of these goals? And from a legal standpoint, I think, setting well-informed, valid timeframes is critically important, because if you don't set realistic timeframes, I think that may, increase the risk at an even higher level of, having this look like a quota or a goal. And particularly if it's a quota or a goal that has a unrealistic time frame around it, that may push the organization and people within the organization to make decisions that might not be legally supportable. If these are goals that the data says cannot be, really achieved through legitimate and legal business means.
Right. Okay, so moving on to client example 3, quickly. This example, we're looking at equal pay for equal work. So this is another way to ensure that there's equality for similarly situated people within our organization. And so, the way we would do this is this is very data driven and statistics driven. The general approach is to find out who is similarly situated and then to test if there are differences in pay by race, ethnicity, gender groups. So the model, we might control for things like tenure, performance reviews, and education, and it could go on and on what we're controlling for here. And there's many things that we would need to consider when selecting model variables. The first is, we need to be careful that performance reviews, for example, are not biased if we're going to use that as a control. Some variables like test scores, standardized tests need to be evaluated by an IO expert for validity. There are questions around, whether a facially neutral factor is causing the disparity. Education, for example, could be viewed as a significant pre-market factor. So something that's outside of the company's control. If after you control for it, there's no difference in compensation. There are variables that really could discriminate against women who take time off to start a family when we control for things like time and position or tenure. Those variables could explain away the difference in pay, but maybe it's not right really to do that. It's very specific analysis that depends on a lot of factors. So now getting into best practices.
Yeah. So to try to sum up and what we're talking about as far as how to do this sort of work and analysis in a way that doesn't get you sued, and also really furthers the ultimate goals here. And I've just laid out here some examples of best case and not so best case scenarios. In terms of how to frame goals for broad communication, it's certainly valid to say, if you're undertaking this initiative, that our goal is to ensure that our processes comply with existing law, and that we're also doing an analysis to identify criteria that are impeding our efforts to improve the diversity, equity, and fairness within the organization, and that through our analysis we've identified are not truly necessary to meet the other goals of the organization. It's also valid and I think necessary to communicate that you are setting goals and you are using statistics to set a baseline to see where your organization is now. So you have a framework for measuring as you undertake DEI initiatives, such as expanding the schools that you recruit from, expanding your outreach to different communities, implementing assistance with commuting for those people in areas that Candice alluded to that earlier, that may have difficulty getting to your workplace. Measuring as you implement those changes. Are they working? Are they not working? What could you do else? Could you do to, again, move the needle forward? On the other hand, as we've alluded to before, setting a bottom line quota or goal in the same way that you'd set a quota for a salesperson to earn a commission is going to be legally problematic, and it's going to create incentives within the organization that create problems and misinterpretation of what you're trying to achieve, and it would not comply with existing case law as pertains to the ability to explicitly rely on race in making decisions.
Best practices would include evaluating DEI goals with analytical rigor, assessing the flow of employees and groups of employees through the whole organization to identify trends and opportunities to increase diversity or reduce problems with diversity. Encouraging a culture of transparency around DEI metrics and data collection. This is getting the whole company on board. Collect and evaluate metrics over time, evaluate the metrics and goals with rigor, check for practical and statistical significance, or ask your statistician, analyst to do this, and beware of some of the pitfalls that I covered. And conducting regular workforce composition assessments and pay audits is, of course, another best practice.
And I also alluded to earlier, there's historically, particularly among us lawyers, there's been a fear of sometimes of collecting data and really digging in and analyzing the data. Those fears can be overcome, and I think us lawyers have to, in some respects, get over ourselves in terms of those concerns, particularly those of us who've done a lot of litigation historically. Data has power, and like all sorts of, all types of power. If you're into superhero movies, power can be used for good and it can be used for not so good. If you do it the right way, it can be used as a force. Statistics can be used as a force of good. It needs to be, this sort of analysis needs to be done under the direction and guidance of legal counsel. An organization needs at the front end to determine the level of confidentiality that the organization wants to have for this exercise, just like it does for any other business-related and employment-related information. In some cases, this may be part of an initiative that is going to be publicly disclosed, but if you're going into that with that being the goal, do that knowingly and intentionally. If, however, it's for internal use, treat it like you would other attorney-client privilege data or other confidential and sensitive business data. So to sum it up, in terms of two real-world scenarios, training, is alluded to earlier, of your workforce and the people involved in this process, not only in the analysis, but ultimately in the people that are going to be implementing the real-world initiatives, have to be trained on what this sort of analysis means and does not mean. The nightmare scenario for us lawyers is shown here on the screen. You have a hiring manager who is sitting across the desk, or for the last year and a half, sitting on a Zoom screen talking to a potential candidate, white male, and the manager says, "Joe, your resume is impeccable. You're just what we need for the job, but I just went through this presentation that HR gave us showing that we have way too many white men already. Sorry, just your timing's not right here." That makes me and every lawyer break out in hives. So the people on the ground involved in actually making the decisions that are going to be part of your DEI process need to be trained on what this sort of analysis means and what it doesn't mean. And the right way to look at it, the right way to communicate it, the right way to use an analysis like this is, if you see there's a discrepancy in your workforce, and you have done the sort of AI analysis that Candice went over before, and you see that, okay, we've been always thinking, we want experienced folks, but your analysis shows that, well, the correlation between experience and success, or experience and retention for that matter, isn't what you thought it was, because experienced folks who you steal from your competitors several years later end up going to moving on. You can use data to see that, okay, well, maybe this isn't the best way to go about it. Relying on experience because this position is historically imbalanced based upon race is not going to further our DEI goals. And the data also shows it may not further our business goals, because we're just hiring people that are going to leave us in a few years. So that is an example of the power of data, and how data can be used to really to move the needle in the right direction. Alluding back to a question, I think it was the first question, and it was more of a comment made at the outset of the presentation about the need to recruit from non-traditional and outside sources, data allows you to show whether or not these initiatives are working. And they also allow you to make the business case to people who may be used to the tried and true. We've always done word of mouth hiring. We've always recruited from certain colleges. Why can't we keep doing it? It's working so far. Data can show you, well, maybe it's not working as well as you thought it would, and maybe there's better ways to do things. So with that, I think, do you see any other questions we haven't touched on?
I think we've covered them, unless I'm missing something here.
Actually, I have one that is definitely one you're going to have to answer.
I see one directed to Michael.
So, well, I'll read the one I see that it's not directed to me, but I don't know the answer, so I'll ask it to you.
Okay.
How do you address weighted values when the actual data may not be sizable, especially with smaller groups?
I have to admit, I don't remember the context this question is asked, and it was at 110. I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry to say. I don't understand the context. I don't remember the context of it.
Yeah, and I'm thinking this may get at the problem you identified with the adverse impact ratio, and when you have smaller groups, that may not.
Yeah, if that's the question, yeah, there are problems with using some of the test for practical significance when you have a small sample size. That's why it's nice to use more than one test in issues like this to see if all of the tests are supportive of a finding of disparate impact. I'm wondering if this is actually in reference to the slide where I'm establishing what the aspirational goal is, where we weight the different data sources. And I think, the answer again, it really depends, and we'd have to use our best judgment to see if we have enough data that it's valuable to us and useful. And that would really determine what weight we give it. I hope that helps answer the question.
Yeah, and just in terms of my experience in working with folks like Candice, I think, a experienced, knowledgeable statistician who knows the both the strengths and potential flaws in statistics can, identify, okay, is this problem of the smaller group, does that render, the analysis invalid or suspect in some way, because, without that knowledge of both the power and potential shortfalls in what statistics can tell you, you can draw, improper conclusions if you're, from different analyses.
Right.
So I see the question you're referring to now, Candice. It says, Michael, can you expand on the pessimistic view regarding reverse discrimination if we have DEI goals? And I maybe my last slide addressed that. In the simplest, example, it is a concern I would have is if you communicate, numerical goals, that those would be, the purpose of those goals would be misinterpreted by the individuals that need to make decisions to further those goals, that they are interpreted as quotas or literal goals and implemented in such a way as individuals are making decisions just to meet the numbers, as opposed to making decisions based upon valid business concerns. Again, it is, if you see that your current, where your workforce currently is not where you'd like it to be in terms of the aspirational goals that the analysis says are achievable, it's perfectly appropriate to say, okay, we're going to start recruiting from new sources we haven't looked at. But it's not appropriate to say, okay, we are going to hire to a certain number of quota just to achieve those numbers. And it's certainly not appropriate to tell candidates that the reason why we're not hiring you is because you don't fit in with the demographic numbers that we're trying to achieve here. So with that, Candice and I will take a look through all other questions, and if there's any we missed, we will do our best to respond to you by email and give you answers. And in the wake of this, if you have any further questions, feel free to submit emails. Our email address, Candice is showing it on the screen, and also. If you haven't received it yet, we will be emailing everybody a copy of the PowerPoint, and our email addresses will be in there. So feel free to reach out. And
yes, yeah.
thank you for your time today.
Yeah, we're happy to answer any more questions, so don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you so much for being here.